Room 12 stayed quiet. Too quiet. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Comment your city. I love seeing them. Wolfe listens for the truth hidden in silence. Nero Wolfe has taken jobs for money, boredom, vanity, and once because a cheese importer offended Fritz. I had never seen him interested in a hotel room. That changed on a Thursday morning when a man came saying a midtown room had stopped behaving like a room. At 10 o'clock I was at my desk, typing a report Wolfe would grumble over. Orchids had been admired, breakfast demolished, and he was settled with Plutarch and beer. That hour is supposed to be protected. The front bell rang anyway, 3 quick, nervous chimes with a guilty sound. Fritz answered. I heard voices in the hall and the squeak of a twisted hat. Then Fritz appeared with his look for callers between meals. Behind him stood a man in a grey suit, shoulders straight, eyes measuring the room before admitting Wolfe in the big chair existed. He was late 40s, neat but not flashy, grey at the temples, polished shoes. His hands clamped a felt hat as if letting go would drop him. My name is Paul Haviland, he said. I telephoned yesterday. I was told Mr. Wolfe is not taking new matters. That was accurate, Wolfe said without looking up. I am still not. Haviland hesitated. My wife sent me, Mr. Wolfe, he said. She says you may be the only man in New York who could hear what I have to tell you and not call a doctor. He closed the book on one finger and let his eyes travel over Haviland. Sit down, Mr. Haviland, he said. Since your wife trusts my sanity, I should hear what threatens yours. Archie, your notebook. I got it. Haviland took the red leather chair, but only the edge. It concerns a room at the Eldridge Hotel, he said. Room 12, 3rd floor. I've been staying there nights a week for a year. My firm keeps an apartment, but I simply prefer the hotel. Does your wife approve this arrangement? Wolfe asked. Haviland's mouth tightened. She knows, he said. I work late. The trains are bad. I sleep there. It has been convenient, nothing more. Wolfe snorted about improbabilities and waved him on. Last week a woman took room 12, Haviland said. She signed in as Margaret Lane, he went on. I was in 14 across the hall. The first night I heard ordinary noise from her room. The second night there was nothing, though the light under her door burned till morning. The third night I came in. Her light was still on. I told myself I was a fool and knocked to ask if anything was wrong, he said. No answer, but someone came to the door. You know when a person is inches away, listening. It went on until I knew the knob would turn. I went downstairs. Next morning, a maid took up coffee. It came back untouched, he went on. She swears she has never been inside. Each day the staff is told from the room telephone to leave the sign in place. Yesterday the manager opened the door with a policeman. The room was empty. Wolfe shifted in his chair. And why? He asked. Bring this to me instead of the police? Haviland's fingers dug into the hat. Because I was in the lobby when that call came, he said. The clerk put it on speaker. The voice was hers. And my wife heard that same voice 2 months ago, he added. She answered our home phone. It asked for me by name, calm as anything, then hung up. That frightened her enough to insist I come to you. Wolfe shut his eyes briefly and opened them again. He flicked a glance at me. Very well, he said. Archie, you will go to this Eldridge Hotel and examine their miraculous room 12. If a hotel intends to quarrel with reality inside my city, I prefer to know which side is winning. Fritz packed me off with a sandwich and a look that suggested I ought to take a sweater, a sentiment he reserved for small children and me on cold days. I didn't need a sweater, but I needed facts, and the Eldridge Hotel had been waiting for me ever since Haviland opened his mouth. I took a cab, because Wolfe would grouse if I wasted time, and because walking 3 miles to a mystery sounded earnest enough to be suspicious. The Eldridge sat wedged between a print shop and a bakery, the kind of old hotel that still relied on polished brass and the memory of better decades. Inside, The lobby smelled like lemon oil and single men killing time between trains. The clerk's eyes met mine with the weary look of someone who had already had one too many odd guests today. I introduced myself, flashed the license, and said I was there on behalf of a concerned party who thought Room 12 was developing personality quirks. The clerk tightened, which I took as confirmation he knew exactly what I meant. He led me to a carpeted staircase and up to the 3rd floor, talking in a whisper as if the hall had airs. He said they'd had disturbances, though he wouldn't define the word. When we reached Room 12, he stopped, hands clasped, and nodded at the door like it was a shy child refusing to come to supper. I knelt to check the lock, not because I expected fingerprints or wizardry, but because looking like you know what you're doing helps people relax. The lock was standard, scratched just enough to show use but not tampering. I listened. Nothing but air and the hum of old wiring. I knocked, waited, and knocked again. No footsteps, no voice, not even the shift of weight inside. The clerk swallowed like he was expecting me to perform an exorcism. I asked him to open it. He hesitated, but I used the tone Wolfe uses on me when he wants compliance without conversation. He produced the key and turned it with theatrical caution. The room opened like any other room. The bed was made, the air was still, and the bedside lamp was on, exactly as Haviland had described. But the strange part wasn't the light, it was the sense that the room had been paused, not abandoned, not lived in, just paused. A suitcase stood near the chair. A scarf lay on the dresser. Everything looked arranged by someone who expected to return in 5 minutes. I checked the closet. Empty. The bathroom, too. Nothing out of place, nothing missing, nothing alive. I asked the clerk about the maid's story. He stiffened and said she had told him she never stepped inside since the guest's arrival, yet the towels kept changing and the trash was occasionally emptied. That was interesting because people don't usually take out their own trash before evaporating. I walked through again, slower. The walls were thick enough to muffle ordinary sounds, but not thick enough to hide a living human. I checked the window. Locked from the inside. Fire escape accessible only from the hall window, not this one. I asked who had opened the room with police yesterday. He said the manager had, and that the cop had written it off as an absent guest who would eventually turn up. The clerk didn't believe that. His voice dipped when he admitted the manager now wanted the room sealed for maintenance until next week. I said I'd like to speak with the manager. The clerk said he was out. That told me he was avoiding the room as much as any guest would. Before leaving, I checked the bedside table and saw a notepad with the hotel's logo. No indentation marks, no scribbles, nothing but a blank top sheet. I pocketed it, because blank paper can be just as telling as scribbled paper when Wolfe gets in the mood. I turned off the lamp, opened the door, and walked out. When I glanced back, the clerk flinched. The lamp was on again. I hadn't touched the switch. The clerk's face drained like someone had just flipped his internal fuse box. He started to reach toward the switch, then thought better of it, and took a step back. I went in again, because I don't like being corrected by lamps. The bulb glowed steady, nothing flickering or faulty. I touched the switch. It clicked down, but the light stayed on. The clerk made a noise somewhere between a prayer and a hiccup. I flipped it up again, then down. Nothing. So either the wiring had personality disorders or someone had interfered with the switch plate. I knelt to check the screws. They were tight. The plate didn't budge, and yet the lamp shone as if daring me to argue. I unplugged the lamp from the wall. The bulb went out. I plugged it back in. Still out. I examined the wiring. Basic, unremarkable, old enough to remember when the Eldridge catered to traveling actors and mid-range salesmen. Nothing tampered with. I glanced once more around the room. The air had developed a faint scent, something like cheap perfume, the kind you'd find in drugstores with price tags already peeling. It hadn't been there before. I looked at the clerk, who was blinking hard, maybe hoping the smell belonged to his imagination. He insisted he had never smelled anything in here except disinfectant and old carpet. I didn't doubt him. I told him to keep the room locked until further notice and to inform no one I had visited. He agreed, though his voice cracked like a board under weight. I took the stairs down and hit the lobby, feeling the faint but persistent sensation of being watched from behind. Not by a person, by the idea of a person. Some rooms develop memory, even if they shouldn't. I told the clerk I'd return later with instructions and left before he could ask what kind. Outside, the afternoon air felt like a reward for surviving the Eldridge. I headed back to the brownstone, thinking about Haviland's wife and her calm phone call from a stranger with the same voice as a woman who had then checked into a hotel room she no longer inhabited. I wasn't ready to explain any of that to Wolfe, but he wasn't expecting explanations. He preferred data he could arrange like chess pieces. I took the subway because I needed time to think. The train rattled through tunnels while I considered the perfume, the unplugged lamp, and the maid's invisible housekeeping. Either someone wanted to sell the hotel as haunted, or someone didn't want room 12 inspected by anyone with more nerve than a custodian. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in the office draining a bottle of beer with the detachment of a monk attending morning prayer. I reported the visit step by step, including the lamp's resurrection and the faint perfume. I produced the blank notepad page. He took it with 2 fingers, as though expecting it to confess. He sniffed the air, wrinkled his nose, and said the scent on my coat was synthetic, poorly manufactured, and a crime against botanicals, which roughly matched my own impressions. I told him about the manager's absence and the clerk's fear. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment, which meant he was assembling a pattern. He asked if the suitcase looked used. I said yes, but lightly. He asked about the scarf. Silk, patterned, folded neatly. Wolfe muttered that a guest who meant to vanish rarely left behind personal articles arranged thoughtfully. Then he asked the only question he actually cared about. Was someone in that room with me at any point? I said no. He asked if someone could have been. That took longer. No signs of hidden entrances, no vents big enough for a child, no corners dark enough for a cat. But the perfume had arrived when nothing else had moved. Wolfe told me to fetch Haviland. I said the man would crumble if the lamp looked at him wrong. Wolfe didn't care. He said we needed context. When Wolfe asks for context, it means he suspects a shape behind the noise. I went to call Haviland, but before I could reach the phone, the bell rang again. This time it was one long, steady chime, confident and cold. Someone who wasn't frightened at all had come to visit. I crossed the hall before Fritz could get there, because a confident chime tends to earn a personal greeting. I opened the door to a woman standing as if she had been posed for a portrait no one asked to paint. Tall, mid-30s, dark hair, in a cut that suggested expensive appointments and decisive mornings. Her coat was black wool, tailored sharp enough to imply she could stab someone simply by turning. She looked at me with cool curiosity, the kind people use when they want to see how quickly you'll reveal your IQ. I didn't oblige. She asked for Nero Wolfe by name. No introduction, no preamble, just a statement, the way you'd ask for salt. I stepped aside to let her in, because she wasn't the kind you argue with on the threshold unless you enjoy missing persons reports. Fritz retreated without needing to be told, which meant he didn't trust her vibes any more than I did. I led her to the office, and she walked with the pace of someone who expects corridors to widen for her. Wolfe looked up as she entered, and his eyebrows did a short, silent climb. He didn't stand, of course, but he did the equivalent of it for him. He set down his beer. She didn't bother pretending to admire the decor. Her eyes moved over Wolfe, then over me, and finally settled somewhere in the middle as if measuring the space needed to speak freely. She said her name was Linda Marsden. The voice was calm, low, the kind that could talk you into buying insurance or confessing to the wrong crime. Wolfe asked how he could assist her, which is Wolf for "Why are you in my house interrupting digestion?" She said she was looking for her sister, Margaret Lane. That tightened the air, because we had been waiting for that name to walk through some door eventually, just not this one. I watched Wolfe watching her. When he goes still like that, it means the mental engine has decided its preferred gear. She said Margaret left their shared apartment 3 weeks ago after an argument about money. They hadn't spoken since. Yesterday, Linda received a call. The voice said Margaret was safe but needed time. Then it disconnected. Linda said the voice was hers, but softened, as if slowed or filtered. She tried callback. Nothing. She called friends. They hadn't seen Margaret in days. Linda said she went to the police, but the officer on duty gave her a form and told her to come back if Margaret didn't appear within a week. She said she had heard of Wolfe's reputation for discretion. Wolfe accepted that without modesty. She added she knew Margaret had once stayed at the Eldridge Hotel. Wolfe didn't blink, but my heartbeat did a quick 2-step. I asked if Margaret had ever used an alias. Linda said yes. Sometimes Margaret checked into hotels under Lane, sometimes under Carver, depending on whether she was trying to avoid an ex or a creditor. The suitcase and scarf made more sense now. Margaret had a habit of running from things and leaving breadcrumbs. Wolfe asked if Margaret had enemies. Linda said not enemies, but complications. A former employer she had accused of harassment, a boyfriend who thought jealousy counted as affection, and a friend she suspected had stolen from her. Wolfe asked for names. She produced a card with 3 written on the back in tidy handwriting that didn't match her voice. Wolfe took it without comment, though his fingers tightened slightly. I watched her closely. The perfume on her coat wasn't the cheap stuff from room 12. Hers was too refined, too steady. She didn't flinch when Wolfe mentioned the Eldridge. She only asked if something had happened there connected to her sister. Wolfe didn't answer, which was his way of collecting more lies before choosing which truth to reveal. Wolfe finally told her he would consider taking the matter. She asked the cost. He gave a range that would make a banker reconsider his pride. She nodded without blinking, which told me she either had resources or was desperate enough to borrow them. He said he needed time and would send for her when he required details. She rose, thanked him with a nod that was polite but not deferential, and walked out with the same confident rhythm she arrived with. When the door closed, Wolfe let out a breath like he'd been holding it since she entered. He told me to visit Haviland immediately, bring him back, and make sure he didn't stop to reconsider on the way. I asked if Linda Marston had told the truth. Wolfe said she had given a version of it. The rest, he said, was still hiding in room 12. Then he added that the lamp wasn't a parlor trick. Someone was playing with deception, and he intended to know who before they decided to play with him. Getting Haviland back to the brownstone sounded easy on paper. In practice, he had the kind of nerves that make a man recheck locks in conversations. I phoned his office first. His secretary said he was in conference, which is corporate for hiding behind paperwork. I told her it was Archie Goodwin, and that if he didn't come to the phone, I'd drive over and start asking the wrong questions to the right people. That produced him in under a minute. His voice on the line was stretched thin. I said Wolfe wanted him now. He started to ask why. I told him if I could explain it briefly, Wolfe wouldn't need him. That convinced him. We set a time 30 minutes out. He arrived late by 10. I met him at the door. He had adjusted his tie 3 times on the way, judging by the wrinkles. When he saw the office again, he relaxed by degrees until he noticed the faint trace of perfume still lingering from Linda Marston's visit. He sniffed, frowned, and glanced around. Wolfe saw it and stored it away. Haviland nodded stiffly and sat when told. Wolfe said another party had come seeking a missing woman named Margaret Lane and asked if the name meant anything to him. Haviland said no, automatically, then hesitated and corrected himself. He had heard the name at the Eldridge. A clerk had mentioned a Miss Lane once while complaining about guests who extended their stay without notice. He hadn't thought anything of it. Wolfe asked about the phone call his wife had taken, the one with Margaret's voice. Did his wife describe the tone? Calm, he said. Distant, as if speaking from another room. Then Wolfe did something he seldom does early. He asked what Haviland had failed to mention. Haviland flinched. He said there was nothing. Wolfe closed his eyes, which is like announcing he has moved you to a different, less flattering shelf in his mind. Under that weight, Haviland cracked. He admitted he had not always used room 14. Sometimes, he confessed, he had taken room 12 himself, long before Margaret checked in. Not regularly, but enough that the staff joked it belonged to him in spirit. That phrase made Wolfe's lips purse. He asked if anything unusual had happened during those earlier stays. At first, Haviland said no. Then he remembered once waking up to find the lamp on now. He was sure he had turned it off. Another time he had come back from dinner to discover his suitcase standing open, though he locked it. Nothing missing, nothing added. Just opened and closed again. He had written it off as his own forgetfulness. Wolfe asked him to describe the staff he knew by sight. The clerk, the manager, a maid named Josie who liked to talk more than dust. Any regulars who seemed overly familiar with him. Haviland listed them, slow and careful. Wolfe had me note the names, then asked the key question. Had Haviland ever told anyone outside the hotel that he stayed there alone? Haviland thought, then admitted he had once mentioned it to a colleague over drinks, and once, bitterly, during a quarrel with his wife. She had told him the hotel would swallow him one day if he kept preferring it to his own house. That earned a grunt from Wolfe. He announced that the next step required more than my meager talents. He wanted Saul Panzer to visit the Eldridge quietly, as a guest, and see who paid attention. He also wanted me to renew my acquaintance with Room 12 and the manager who avoided it. When Wolfe brings Saul into the cast, it means he expects the scenery to start lying. I went to the phone to call Saul, wondering whether the first thing he'd notice at the Eldridge would be the carpet or the perfume. Saul picked up on the second ring, because he's a man who treats telephones as tools, not ornaments. I gave him the Eldridge, Room 12, the vanishing occupant, the disobedient lamp, and the perfume that arrived on cue. He listened without a word. When I finished, he asked how nervous the staff were and how interested Wolfe really was. I told him the staff were spooked and Wolfe had already traded comfort for curiosity. That did it. Saul said he could be checked in by 7 and wanted the names of the clerk, the maid, and any regulars who might know more than they said. I promised an envelope at the desk under a name the Eldridge didn't know yet. When I hung up and reported, Wolfe nodded once, as if a piece he liked had slid into place. He reminded me I still had to see the manager who had opened Room 12 and then hidden in his office. Haviland left looking wrung out. I put on my coat and headed back downtown, wondering whether the hotel would be glad to see me or treat me as another symptom. The manager's office had oak paneling, a safe and a framed sketch of the hotel in its youth. The man behind the desk was in his 50s, smooth-faced, hair disciplined into a style that suggested long practice. He introduced himself as Clay Torrance and did not offer his hand. I said I represented a party concerned with a guest named Margaret Lane, and asked why he had brought a policeman upstairs. He said a guest in another room had complained about low, steady talking from 12 at odd hours, like someone repeating one sentence. When the clerk went up, the sign was on the knob and the latch set. No answer. Torrance disliked calling the police, but disliked headlines more. They opened the room, found it empty, and the officer muttered about practical jokes. What bothered Torrance was the record. The key card log showed entries for 12. At times, no one on staff remembered seeing anyone go in or out. He called it a glitch without believing it. I asked to see the log. He hesitated, then pulled it up. The pattern was simple and wrong. Normal entries for the first 2 days. Then one at 3 in the morning with no recorded exit. Later that morning, another entry, again without witnesses. I asked who could program or duplicate a card. Torrance said only himself and his senior clerk, Dwyer, who also handled the night audit. Too many keys for one pocket, I suggested. Torrance replied that Dwyer had been there 15 years and was sound. I let it pass. I asked about the maid, Josie. He said she was reliable and talkative, inclined to see more than was there, but honest. I said I wanted a word with her. He phoned housekeeping and told her to come to the office when she finished the room she was on. That gave me a few minutes, which I spent where Wolfe would have wanted, on the 3rd floor, looking at doors. The hallway was quiet, the kind of quiet that belongs to buildings that have heard too much. Room 12 waited with its brass number and its dangling sign. I let it alone. Instead, I tried 14, which Haviland favored. It was unlocked. Whoever had last cleaned it had done a decent job. The spread was tight, the bathroom wiped, the air scrubbed of personality. Only one thing argued. The telephone on the bedside table sat just off its cradle. Not enough to drop the line, just enough to notice if you are the kind of man who spends his life in rooms. I am. I picked it up. No dial tone, no buzz. Only silence pressed against my ear, someone on the other end listening and not answering. I kept the phone to my ear, listening to the kind of silence that isn't empty but waiting. There was no breath, no shifting, no background hiss. Just the sense that 1 inch beyond the line, someone was deciding whether to acknowledge me. I've held phones that went dead, and this wasn't dead. It was poised. After 20 seconds, the receiver clicked softly, not from my end. The line cut clean. I hung up and stood still long enough to be sure no one had slipped into the hall during the performance. The carpet offered no creaks, the air no whispers. Room 14 had played its hand, and it was as subtle as Wolfe on a diet. Before I could test the phone again, a soft throat clearing came from behind me. Josie, the maid, stood near the stairwell, holding a cart piled with towels. She had round shoulders and the nervous smile of someone who apologizes for existing. She said Mr. Torrance told her I wanted a word. I walked her down the hall a few feet to avoid the acoustics playing tricks. She said she didn't know anything, which is exactly what people say when they know something they don't trust themselves to say right. I asked simply whether she had ever gone into room 12 after the guest arrived. Her eyes darted toward the door, then back to me. She swore she hadn't, but someone had been putting fresh towels inside after she left them on her cart. I asked who. She said no one. The towels vanished from the cart and reappeared, folded inside the room. At first she thought she was mistaken. Then she started counting. One afternoon she left 3 towels on top. When she returned, the cart held only 1. She checked room 12. 2 towels were on the rack. She insisted she never entered. She was too scared. I asked what scared her. She said it was the voice. Sometimes when she vacuumed the hall, she heard a soft murmur through the door, like a woman humming or repeating a phrase too quiet to understand. When the humming stopped abruptly, she always felt chills on her arms. She never heard footsteps, never heard the door open, only the humming. Then nothing. I asked how long ago she heard it last. She said 2 days ago, early afternoon. That was before Torrance opened the room with the policeman. She added that nobody believed her except maybe Dwyer, the night clerk, and he told her to keep quiet because hotels didn't pay for imagination. I thanked her, told her to keep her routine and not change anything. She nodded and pushed her cart away, glancing at room 12 as if expecting it to blink at her. I returned to Torrance's office. He looked relieved when I came in alone. I said he needed to keep a close eye on who approached 12 in the next 48 hours, and to treat any late-night calls or knocks as relevant. He asked what he should tell his staff. I said as little as possible, unless he wanted to test how quickly a rumor could take down occupancy. He didn't like that advice, but he liked the alternative less. I left the hotel after slipping Saul's envelope to the clerk with a name on it I hoped Saul still liked. Outside, night had started to collect in the corners, and the streetlights were deciding whether to bother turning on. I walked 2 blocks before realizing my coat carried that faint perfume from 12 again, even though I hadn't been inside. Either I had brushed against something in the hall, or the scent had lingered more aggressively than I realized. By the time I reached the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with another beer, and the air of a man settling in to be irritated. I gave my report from the beginning. Torrance's logs, Josie's towels, Room 14's silent phone companion, and the perfume I couldn't explain. Wolfe listened with the serene focus he reserves for orchids and crimes that insult his intellect. He asked if the voice on the phone resembled anything I'd heard before. I said no. He asked whether the silence felt like a person or a trick. I said a person, or at least someone who understood the value of being present without participating. Wolfe grunted, that low rumble he makes when a fact fits too neatly. He said the explanation would not be supernatural, sentimental, or convenient. Someone wanted to create the illusion of Margaret Lane moving through that hotel without her actually doing it. Someone wanted witnesses unsettled, not fooled. And someone, he added, had been watching Haviland long before the woman ever checked in. Before I could ask what he meant, the phone rang. Not the house phone, the private line we rarely used. Wolfe stared at it, then told me to answer. I picked it up. The line was open, humming faintly, and a woman's voice, calm, slow, and impossibly close, said my name. Then she whispered, "Tell him I'm still in the room," and the line went dead. Wolfe didn't speak until I put the receiver down, and even then he didn't ask what the voice said. He knew. His eyes were half closed, the way they get when he's filing a fact where it won't escape. I told him anyway, because some things need saying out loud before they feel real. He absorbed it with no visible reaction except a slight tightening of the jaw, a sign most people would miss. He asked whether the voice matched the calm tone Haviland's wife had described. I said yes, almost exactly. Then he asked the question I didn't want. Did it sound like a recording? I told him no. A recording doesn't breathe between syllables, and that whisper had been too precise, too curated for anything canned. He rang for beer, which meant he wanted time, not refreshment. Fritz brought it in, took one look at Wolfe's face, and left without a word. Wolfe sipped once, set the bottle down, and asked what I intended to do next. I said I wanted to return to the Eldridge. He said no. Saul was there now, and Saul's ears were worth more in that building than mine when it came to catching people performing subtle theater. Wolfe declared that the voice had made its move, and any immediate return on my part would disrupt the rhythm whoever orchestrated this had established. He wanted the illusion undisturbed long enough to reveal its seams. I wasn't convinced, but Wolfe's instincts work on a different frequency from human ones. While he thought, I paced. The perfume still clung faintly to my coat, as if the hotel had branded me. Wolfe asked if I had brushed against anyone in the hall. I said no, unless ghosts had elbows. He asked if Josie had touched the coat. She hadn't. He said nothing more, but I caught the spark in his eyes. When Wolfe sees a path, he doesn't announce it until he's ready to walk his way to the end. He stared at the card Linda Marston had given him earlier with the 3 names. One was the former employer, one the jealous boyfriend, one the friend accused of stealing. He asked which of them might have known Haviland. I said I didn't see how any of them could. Wolfe replied that motives rarely require introductions. Connection didn't need proximity, it needed leverage. He tapped the card, muttering that the sister's composure troubled him. People worried about missing siblings don't usually negotiate fees without a tremor. I mentioned she seemed controlled. Wolfe said control is a mask worn either by professionals or liars, sometimes both. The phone's ring had left the office, feeling smaller. Wolfe told me to bring in Mrs. Haviland next. Her reaction to the voice would tell him more than any interview with her husband. I said dragging a worried wife into this circus wasn't going to win us holiday cards. Wolfe replied that this investigation wasn't about etiquette. He wanted her in front of him tonight. He said to call, not to explain, simply to request her presence on a matter involving her husband's safety. That would ensure she came. I didn't argue. Wolfe had already moved on. While I dialed, Wolfe rose, not standing, merely adjusting himself in the chair, but for Wolfe that qualifies as rising. He reached for the notepad from room 12 and held it up to the lamp. There was nothing visible, but he stared at it in a way that made me glance twice. Mrs. Haviland answered and agreed to come immediately. I hung up and turned back just in time to see Wolfe inspecting the edge of the page, running his thumb lightly over the corner as if testing grain. He noticed me watching and lowered the pad. He said I had omitted one detail from my earlier report. I asked which. He said the phone in room 14, the silence that felt like someone listening. He asked whether the click when the line died matched the one from our private line. I replayed the sounds in my head, then admitted it was too close for coincidence. Wolfe nodded slowly, as if confirming an unwelcome suspicion. He said the entire structure of this illusion relied on timing, not sophistication. Someone was choreographing appearances, voices, scents, lights, movements, designed to mimic the presence of Margaret Lane. But choreographers need rehearsal space, and rehearsal always leaves fingerprints on the routine. Wolfe said he believed our choreographer's mistake had just begun to show. Before he could elaborate, the downstairs bell rang. 4 sharp chimes, urgent and off balance. Not Mrs. Haviland. She had been calm on the phone. This ring belonged to someone who feared they were already too late. Wolfe told me to answer it at once, but to be prepared for the truth to arrive, wearing Panic's coat. The bell's urgency hadn't lied. When I opened the door, a man stumbled in on a breath that wasn't doing its job. He clutched the frame like it was the last stable thing left. Early 40s, narrow face, thinning hair, eyes blown wide with panic. I had seen that expression on men who just watched their lives split down the middle. He said my name without prompting and asked if Wolfe was inside. His voice shook like it had miles of fear behind it. I didn't waste time. I brought him to the office. Wolfe didn't bother hiding his irritation at another intrusion, but irritation evaporated when he saw the man's condition. Fritz brought water before I had to ask. The man downed half before he remembered to breathe again. He introduced himself as Victor Dane. The name meant nothing to me. Wolfe asked how he knew where to find us. Dane said Linda Marston had sent him. That made the air tense in the room like a cable pulled tight. He said Linda had phoned him not an hour ago, frantic, saying her sister Margaret had been found. Not in the hotel, not in another apartment. Found, he said, in a way that didn't mean alive. Then she begged him to help her and told him to contact Nero Wolfe at once. Dane said he'd rushed to her apartment, but she wasn't there. The door was unlocked. The lights were on. The place smelled faintly of perfume. He called her name. No answer. He searched the rooms, the closets, the balcony. Nothing. But on the living room table lay her purse and a folded piece of paper with one sentence written in small, neat letters. Room 12 is not empty. Wolfe's eyes narrowed just enough to count as an outburst. I asked Dane what his relationship with Linda was. He said he was her attorney and had handled a dispute involving Margaret months earlier. Linda trusted him. That much was believable. He had the exhausted loyalty of a man who has been cleaning up the same family's messes for a long time. I asked when he last saw Linda before today. He said yesterday morning. She was composed but strained. Wolfe's eyebrow flicked upward at the word composed. Composed was a theme. I asked why Linda would call him instead of the police. Dane said Linda didn't trust the police. They had brushed her off before, dismissed her concerns about Margaret's safety. She believed something was happening that needed to be handled quietly. Quietly, I thought, was exactly how the Eldritch preferred its horrors. Wolfe asked Dane for the sheet of paper. Dane produced it, hands trembling. Wolfe took it and studied it. The ink was fresh, the handwriting the same tidy style Linda had used on the card she gave us. But something in Wolfe's posture said that was only surface. He asked Dane whether Linda ever used perfume. Dane said of course, but he couldn't name it. I leaned in. The paper had a faint trace of the same synthetic cheapness that had trailed me from room 12. Wolfe noticed it too. I told Dane to recount every word Linda had said on the phone. He tried, haltingly, but the panic had blurred the details. She said Margaret was found, then not found, then that she had made a terrible mistake. She urged him to protect himself and to get Wolfe before it was too late. Too late for what? He didn't know. Then she hung up. Wolfe didn't speak. He tapped the paper against his palm, thinking. I knew better than to interrupt when he tapped. After a moment, he said the message was not written in fear. Linda's handwriting was steady, the spacing careful, the words chosen. A panicked woman doesn't compose warnings like invitations. Dane protested, insisting she had been terrified on the phone. Wolfe asked whether he could distinguish terror from performance. Dane reddened, unable to answer. I asked the only question that mattered. If Linda wasn't in her apartment, where was she? Dane said he didn't know, but she hadn't left by taxi or car. He had checked. I asked whether anyone else had keys. He said Margaret and one friend who sometimes watered their plants. Wolfe muttered something under his breath about patterns. Then he ordered me to call Saul, not on the hotel line, on his direct wherever it was. I dialed and waited. Saul picked up in a whisper and told me he was on the 3rd floor near room 12, watching the door of 14. Something was happening. A shadow kept crossing under the door. A figure, he thought, but no one had entered for hours. Before I could relay anything, Saul inhaled sharply, then said in a voice tight as piano wire, Archie, someone just turned the lamp on in 12. No one went in. Would you like me to continue with Section 10 following the same rules and style? Saul didn't waste breath on dramatics, which meant the simple fact of that lamp switching on had weight. I asked if he was sure. He said he was staring straight at the crack under the door when the glow appeared. No footsteps, no sound, no shift of shadow except the one already moving under room 14's door. I told him to stay put and keep watching. He said he didn't plan on dancing. Then the line clicked in that soft, deliberate way that meant he hung up, not the building. I turned to Wolfe, who had listened to my half of the call with the patience of a man parsing code. I relayed Saul's report in full. Wolfe closed his eyes, but not to rest. He was mapping. The tapping of his finger against the arm of the chair slowed until it stopped entirely. When he opened his eyes again, the finality of it was like a verdict. He said the choreography was collapsing. Whoever had been managing rooms 12 and 14 had accelerated their pattern too fast. Acceleration meant fear or desperation, or both. Dane sat rigid in the red leather chair, wringing his hands like he intended to twist them into rope. He asked whether Linda was in danger. Wolfe didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked Dane the nature of the dispute he had handled for Linda and Margaret. Dane said it was minor, a theft accusation Margaret had made against her friend, a woman named Kara Vaughan. The accusation involved missing jewelry and some whispered tension about money. The matter never went to police. Linda had insisted on mediating it privately. Wolfe asked who had sided with whom. Dane admitted Margaret had felt cornered, believing both Linda and Kara were trying to manage her life. Wolfe grunted, a deep sound from the torso that meant more than any sentence. I asked Dane whether he believed Margaret capable of disappearing on her own. He said she enjoyed theatrics, but not the kind that involved isolation. Margaret hated being alone. She liked attention, company, voices, noise. The idea of her sitting quietly in a hotel room humming to herself was wrong. Not impossible, but wrong. Wolfe nodded once. A detail confirmed, though I wasn't sure which. Then Wolfe announced we were ready. Ready for what? He didn't specify, but I'd spent enough years with him to recognize the tone he used when a web he'd been studying finally revealed the spider. He told Dane to stay exactly where he was. He told me to fetch Mrs. Haviland from the front door in case she had arrived. As I crossed the hall, the bell rang again, a single uncertain chime. Perfect timing, which always makes me nervous. Mrs. Haviland was on the step, pale but composed, her handbag clutched close like a shield. She said she had come as instructed. I ushered her in and brought her to the office. When she saw Dane, she stiffened. When she saw the paper with the note about room 12, she nearly gasped, but held it back. Wolfe observed her reaction with the calm dissection of a botanist watching a leaf curl. He asked whether she recognized the handwriting. She said yes. It was Linda's. Her voice cracked on the name. Wolfe then asked her the question he knew mattered most. Had she ever met Linda Marston? The pause before her answer was sharp enough to split a hair. She said yes, but only once, months ago, when Linda sought her out privately to ask about her husband's stays at the Eldridge. That got my attention. Wolfe pressed. What exactly had Linda wanted? Mrs. Haviland swallowed and said Linda had insisted her sister Margaret had been entangled with a man who visited the Eldridge regularly. She believed the man was married and hiding the affair. Linda wanted to know whether Mrs. Haviland suspected her husband of infidelity. The room changed temperature. Dane stared. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. I watched Mrs. Haviland's hands. They trembled, just enough to be real. I asked if she told Linda the truth. She said yes. Her husband was not having an affair, but Linda left unconvinced. She accused Mrs. Haviland of covering for him, then apologized, then left abruptly. She hadn't heard from her since. Wolfe leaned back, the leather protesting faintly. He said it was now clear why Margaret Lane had checked into the Eldridge and why her presence kept shifting like smoke. Someone wanted the impression of a woman haunting the hotel. Someone wanted Haviland implicated, observed, unsettled. Someone wanted Linda trapped between fear for her sister and suspicion of the wrong man. Fear makes people malleable. Suspicion makes them predictable. Then Wolfe delivered the line that told me the endgame had arrived. He said Margaret Lane was not missing. Margaret Lane was nearby, and she had never stopped performing. Before any of us could speak, the phone rang again. Slowly, deliberately. Wolfe looked at me. I answered. The same calm voice breathed into the line, not frantic, not ghostly, not distant. Clear, controlled, familiar now. It said, "You should have stopped him sooner, Archie." Then the voice laughed softly, a short, unsettling exhale. "I'm waiting downstairs." The voice's promise hung in the air like a draft from an open cellar door. I told Wolfe what she'd said. He didn't flinch. Instead, he gestured for Mrs. Haviland and deigned to stay put and instructed me to bring our downstairs visitor up. I went with the kind of caution that keeps you employed. When I opened the door, Linda Marston stood there as if she had been carved out of composure. Her hair was smooth, her coat immaculate, her eyes calm. Too calm. She stepped in without waiting for permission, moving as though she already owned the hallway. I led her to the office, where she took in the assembled audience with a faint, knowing smile. Wolfe watched her as though she were a rare plant blooming out of season. She didn't greet anyone. She only said, "I trust you figured it out." Wolfe replied that he had. He said he appreciated a well-executed illusion but preferred it when the performer didn't leave fingerprints. Linda's smile twitched. Her gaze fell to the note on the table, then to Dane, then finally to Mrs. Haviland, whose expression had tightened like a fist. Linda said calmly that everything she had done was necessary to expose the truth about Margaret. Wolfe corrected her. It wasn't Margaret she had been trying to expose, it was Margaret's leverage. Linda held still, which was as good as confessing. Wolfe explained that Margaret had been using her sister for years, financially, emotionally, and socially. Margaret's charm could sweeten arsenic, but her debts and manipulations always came due. Linda, exhausted, had finally grown afraid of what her sister's schemes would do to her reputation and livelihood. Fear, Wolfe said, made her inventive. Linda's eyes glimmered, not with guilt, but with the pride of a meticulous craftsman finally recognized. Wolfe continued. She crafted the voice, the calls, the whispers, the humming, by recording Margaret months earlier. She used the identical phrasing Margaret often repeated when anxious. She played it through the hotel phone system using a maintenance bypass she discovered during her previous visit investigating Margaret's habits. The towels, the lights, the scents. Those she placed herself, always at times when the hall was empty or when the staff was busy on other floors. She created a haunting because a disappearance would have sparked police interest too quickly, but a haunting subtle and unnerving would unsettle Margaret's creditors and acquaintances without involving law enforcement. Dane asked where Margaret was now. Wolfe answered plainly. Margaret had been in Linda's apartment this entire time. Not captive, but complicit. Margaret had agreed to vanish temporarily in exchange for financial incentive. Linda wanted her sister out of sight long enough to renegotiate certain obligations and dissolve others. Margaret, with debts nipping at her heels, agreed. Their plan was simple. Margaret vanishes mysteriously. Linda panics convincingly. The hotel becomes the stage for a ghost story, and Margaret quietly relocates with the funds Linda provided. But Margaret changed her mind. She wanted more money. When Linda refused, Margaret threatened to reappear loudly and destructively. Linda clenched her jaw, the first real crack in her porcelain composure. Wolfe said that, rather than pay again, she escalated the performance. She used the phone at our brownstone to draw us in, hoping Wolfe would conclude the haunting was psychological sabotage aimed at Haviland. She intended for suspicion to fall on him, giving her time to corner Margaret. But Margaret had slipped away earlier than Linda expected. That, Wolfe added, was why Linda's panic on the phone to Dane had sounded forced. She was improvising without her main actor. At that moment, Saul called. He had found Margaret in a cafe 3 blocks from the Eldridge, suitcase in hand, waiting for a taxi. She had grown tired of playing ghost. I relayed it. Linda froze. Mrs. Haviland exhaled with a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. Dane sank back, stunned. Wolfe folded his hands and told Linda the performance was over. She asked what would happen next. Wolfe said that was up to the authorities, but he would be providing a full account, one free of embellishment. Linda straightened her coat. She looked at Wolfe with a restrained, almost admiring nod, then at me with a flicker of regret. She asked if she might collect her sister before the police did. Wolfe said no. Margaret had already chosen her exit. Linda left the brownstone escorted by Dane, who no longer seemed sure whether he was her lawyer or her last anchor. When the door shut behind them, Wolfe signaled for beer. Dinner would be delayed. He muttered that human folly remained his most reliable workload. I said at least this one hadn't required corpses. Wolfe replied that spiritual hauntings were far more tedious than physical ones. As Fritz announced dinner was finally ready, Wolfe added that illusions are only dangerous when the audience forgets it's a show. He gave me a pointed look, and I took it like a closing curtain.